Blood. That was the first thing I saw when I turned the corner of the park. Bright red streaks on my daughter's shirt, her tiny hands trembling, her wheelchair tilted, and Karen just standing there, her eyes wide but not with guilt. No apology, no panic, just emptiness. In her right hand was a silver pocket knife, the blade still half open, glinting under the sunlight. For a second, I thought I was dreaming, no, nightmaring. My 5-year-old daughter, already fighting battles the world would never understand, had come to the park to feel normal for an hour, to laugh, to breathe fresh air. Instead, she came back bleeding. I couldn't hear the other parents shouting. I couldn't feel the ground beneath my feet. My focus was locked on one thing. Her, my little girl, crying, confused, and covered in blood. The ambulance came fast. Too fast for Karen to slip away unnoticed, but not fast enough to undo what had happened. She was being aggressive, Karen told the officer. Aggressive? My daughter can't even walk. She can barely raise her left arm without help. The words made no sense, but they were coming from the mouth of a woman who spent months weaponizing HOA rules to bully families like mine. The kind who picks fights over lawn lengths, toy bins, and how long your car stays parked on the curb. But a knife? In a park? That wasn't HOA drama. That was something else. Something darker. I kept asking myself, how do we get here? How does a simple Sunday at the park turn into a blood-soaked nightmare? How does a woman so obsessed with control feel bold enough to bring a weapon where children play? And most importantly, how was she allowed to keep doing this for so long? This wasn't an accident, and it sure as hell wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a line crossed, a warning ignored too many times. What happened that day didn't just change my daughter's life, it shattered any illusion of safety we thought we had in our neighborhood. And if you think this is just another Karen story, you haven't heard what came next. My name is Laura Mitchell, and I never imagined I'd be the kind of mother who'd have to say the words. My child was stabbed at the park. We lived in a quiet, tree-lined suburb nestled just outside Atlanta. You know the kind, cookie-cutter houses with picket fences, yards trimmed to HOA standards, and neighbors who wave with plastic smiles. My husband, Robert, and I moved into this community 7 years ago, hoping it would be the perfect place to raise a family. We were young parents back then, hopeful, wide-eyed, and full of dreams. Our daughter, Emily, was born 2 years later on a rainy March afternoon. The doctors told us at birth that she had spina bifida, that she might never walk, that life would be different. And they were right, life was different, but not in the way they meant. Emily wasn't a burden. She was a miracle. From the moment she entered our world, she brought a kind of light you can't explain. She had this infectious laugh that made strangers smile, and this quiet courage that humbled even the strongest people in the room. She loved animals, music, and painting with her fingers, even if she couldn't hold the brush properly. She learned to move around in her custom wheelchair, like it was a part of her, never complaining, never asking why things weren't fair. Emily taught us more about strength in 5 years than we'd learned in our entire lives, but she was also vulnerable, fragile in ways we couldn't always protect her from. The world wasn't made for kids like her. And sadly, neither was our neighborhood. At first, things seemed fine. Our neighbors greeted us when we moved in. Barbecues were held in the cul-de-sac, and everyone exchanged Christmas cards and cookies. But under that surface was something more, an unwritten rulebook, enforced not with kindness but with control. And at the center of it all was Karen. I don't know if that's a real name or just the one the universe assigned her, but she fit the role to perfection. Platinum blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, yoga pants that looked untouched by actual yoga, and an HOA clipboard like it was a weapon. She never screamed. She didn't have to. Karen was the queen of the "I'm just concerned" tone. The passive-aggressive sighs. The notes on your mailbox when your trash bins were visible for 5 minutes too long. The first time she approached us was about the ramp we built for Emily. It was within guidelines approved by the city and professionally installed. But Karen didn't like the aesthetic. She stood at the foot of our driveway, lips pursed, hands on hips. "I'm not saying it's ugly," she began, but it does sort of ruin the flow of the street's symmetry, don't you think? That was Karen's gift, turning ableism into decor commentary. I told her, politely but firmly, that the ramp wasn't going anywhere. She smiled and said she'd bring it up at the next HOA meeting. That was the beginning. Over the next few months, it escalated. She'd report our yard for having a toy left out overnight. She once left a note suggesting we remove Emily's wind chimes from the porch because they were distracting. When Emily tried to join the other neighborhood kids at the park, Karen suddenly began questioning the safety of the playground equipment. What if it's not wheelchair friendly? What if she gets stuck? She called it concern, but it felt like isolation. Karen had this way of using rules to wrap her bias in legitimacy. It wasn't her being exclusionary, it was the guidelines, the regulations, the charter. And then there was the dog incident. Emily loved a golden retriever named Max who lived across the street. She'd go to the fence and giggle as he wagged his tail and licked her fingers. One day, Karen complained that Emily was provoking Max by visiting the fence too often, even though Max's owner had no issue with it. Karen called the HOA, who then called us to remind us about staying within our own property lines. That call felt like a punch in the gut. It was never about dogs or wind chimes. It was about control, about reminding us that in her neighborhood, we were guests, unwanted ones. Still, we tried to keep peace. Robert urged me to ignore her. She thrives on conflict, he said. Just let her huff and puff. And mostly we did. We focused on Emily. We celebrated her milestones, cheered when she painted her first sunset, cried when she said, "I love you, Mommy," in her tiny, determined voice. We even hosted a small birthday party for her 5th, inviting only close friends and neighbors we trusted. Karen wasn't invited, of course. She wouldn't have come anyway, unless it was to cite us for helium balloons being a fire hazard. Then came that day, the day everything changed. It was a bright Saturday morning in late spring. Emily wanted to go to the park. It was a small one, tucked between 2 rows of homes with a shaded bench and a rubber-padded play area. We'd taken her there dozens of times before. I was in the kitchen packing snacks, and our nanny, Maria, had just loaded Emily into her wheelchair. Back in an hour, Maria called out, waving with her usual warmth. I smiled, not knowing that smile would be the last peaceful moment I'd have for weeks. The call came 20 minutes later. Maria's voice was frantic. "Come now. Lauren, Emily is hurt. There's blood. She's bleeding." I dropped the phone. The next few minutes were a blur. I don't even remember how I got to the park. I just ran, barefoot, heartbeat thudding in my ears, praying it was a mistake. But it wasn't. I saw the blood. I saw Emily crying. And I saw Karen standing there like she was the victim. That was the first time I noticed a knife. A small silver one. Foldable. Something that might be on a keychain or tucked into a purse. Later, in the police report, Karen would claim it wasn't an attack, that Emily had startled her, that she panicked. But how does a woman panic and open a knife in a park full of children? How does a 5-year-old in a wheelchair become so threatening that you feel the need to defend yourself with a blade? I didn't buy it for a second. I knew Karen, knew how much she hated not being in control, knew how she'd watched us from behind her curtains, noting every violation, every moment we disrupted her perfect little kingdom. But a knife? Even I hadn't seen that coming. That evening, the ER doctor said the wound wasn't deep. A cut across Emily's forearm. It would heal, physically at least, but the emotional scar, the fear in her eyes, the way she flinched when the nurse leaned in with gauze, that wouldn't vanish so easily. I held her all night, her little body trembling against mine as she whispered, "Why did she do that, Mommy? I didn't do anything wrong." And I didn't have an answer. Because the truth is, this wasn't just about a knife, or a park, or even about Karen. It was about something deeper. About what happens when a community allows power-hungry people to weaponize rules. About what happens when kindness is replaced by control. About what happens when a child becomes a target for no reason other than being different. That day wasn't just the day Emily got hurt. It was the day our illusion of peace shattered. The day we realized that sometimes evil doesn't come in the form of monsters or strangers. Sometimes it lives right next door with a clipboard, a rule book, and a knife. Karen didn't always carry a knife, but she always carried control. Long before the day at the park that left my daughter bleeding, the signs were there, layered in condescension, masked in neighborhood concern, hidden behind every HOA clause she twisted to serve her agenda. It began subtly, like all power obsessions do. At first, it was harmless suggestions at meetings, unsolicited reminders about bylaws, and neighborly emails that never quite felt neighborly. But beneath that polite surface was a woman who needed to rule her environment. She didn't just want order, she wanted obedience. And in her mind, our daughter, our family, and anyone who challenged her control were a threat to that fantasy. After our initial conflict over Emily's ramp, Karen seemed to double down. At HOA meetings, which she chaired with a smug confidence that reeked of entitlement, she'd find new ways to bring us up without saying our names. We need to discuss front yard modifications that are visually disruptive, she'd announce. Or, some neighbors have let their children bring noise-polluting toys into shared spaces. I think we all agree the park is meant to be peaceful. Her words were always vague enough to avoid direct accusations, but pointed enough that everyone knew who she meant. Her circle of allies, mostly other retired residents who shared her obsession with regulation, nodded along, never questioning her authority. Soon, she began targeting the park. She'd been fine with it for years, but once she saw Emily playing there more often, laughing in her wheelchair, painting with chalk, blowing bubbles with the neighbor's kid, suddenly the park became a hazard. First, she requested that the benches be removed because they were attracting loiterers. Then, she claimed the rubber flooring was damaged and filed a complaint with the city about unsafe playground equipment. When that failed, she suggested the park hours be shortened to reduce potential incidents. It was clear what she was doing, trying to make the park inaccessible without outright banning Emily. She even tried to rally support for a quiet hours rule, citing that children playing in the late afternoon disturbed her meditation time. I attended every HOA meeting during that period, my hands clenched under the table, watching as she turned the room into her personal court, throwing out policies like arrows, each one aimed at silencing the joy my daughter brought to that park. But it wasn't just meetings. She began to hover, watching, waiting. Every time Maria or I wheeled Emily down the sidewalk, Karen was there, watering plants that didn't need water, adjusting a flower pot, sweeping a porch already spotless. And every time she had something to say, make sure she doesn't get too close to the fountain. Kids have fallen in, Be careful with the paint. Some neighbors complained about color stains on the pavement. She was squealing a bit loudly the other day. I'm just saying, some of us are sensitive to sound. I try to brush it off. I told myself she was just bitter, lonely, perhaps bored in her retirement. But I was wrong. It wasn't boredom, it was control. One afternoon, Emily came home crying. Her eyes red, her face pale. Maria, shaken, said that Karen had shouted at Emily for being reckless on the slide. She shouldn't be using equipment not designed for the handicapped, Karen had said, loud enough for the other children to hear. What if she falls? What if she breaks something? Who's liable then? Emily, being the strong-hearted little soul she is, had just looked at her and said, I'm just playing. But even strength has its limits. That day, Emily didn't want to go back to the park. That one moment, that single outburst, had punctured her joy. Karen wasn't just regulating, she was terrorizing. The next escalation came not with words, but with actions. One morning, we found our front yard flower bed trampled. Emily's small wind chimes lay twisted on the porch. Our security footage was inconclusive, just shadows and a figure too distant to identify. We filed a report, but the officer shrugged. Could have been anyone. Kids, maybe. But I knew. This wasn't random. Karen had warned us before. Said the chimes were a visual distraction, said our sunflowers blocked the aesthetic flow of the block. And now they were destroyed. The timing wasn't coincidence. That same week, a letter came from the HOA. We were being fined for unauthorized exterior decorations and for yard violations. I laughed when I read it, not out of humor, but disbelief. Our yard was immaculate. The only difference was the small wooden butterfly Emily had painted and hung on the tree out front. A butterfly, and somehow that had become a violation. When I brought it up at the meeting, Karen didn't even flinch. "We all must follow the rules," she said calmly, adjusting her scarf. "It's not personal." But of course it was. Everything she did was personal. Neighbors began to notice. Some avoided the drama, but others quietly reached out. "She's watching everyone," one mother told me. "She yelled at my son for skateboarding on the sidewalk." Another said, "She reported us for having string lights up past Christmas." But still no one stood up. Fear, perhaps, or apathy. Or maybe they didn't think it would escalate beyond fines and notes. But I did. I felt it in my gut. The way she stared at Emily, the intensity with which she guarded her illusion of control. It wasn't just about rules anymore, it was about dominance. She needed to win, needed to feel like she still mattered in a world that was moving on without her. I tried to keep things peaceful. I really did. I offered to meet privately to discuss compromises. She refused. I invited her to Emily's art show at the community center. She ignored it. I even wrote a letter, firm but respectful, asking her to stop singling out our daughter. Her response was cold and mechanical. All residents are expected to comply with HOA expectations. No one is exempt. Robert was furious. He wanted to move, said we should just leave, find a place where our daughter could be free. But I didn't want Karen to win. I didn't want Emily to grow up thinking the answer to bullies was always to run. So we stayed. We smiled through clenched teeth. We documented everything. And Emily, brave as ever, began to return to the park, hesitant at first, then more freely. She made new friends. She learned to swing, with help. She painted rainbows on the sidewalk. She chose not to be afraid. And that's what enraged Karen the most. Not the ramp, not the chimes, not the butterfly, but the resilience, the refusal to break, the joy that bloomed in the face of her oppression. Karen didn't want rules, she wanted submission. And when she couldn't control us with words, with notes, with fines, she resorted to something else. A knife. But by the time that happened, the damage had already been done. The control she'd clung to had slipped into obsession. And obsession, when left unchecked, doesn't just destroy fences or flower beds. It wounds people. It scars children. It poisons communities. Karen wanted to control everything, but in doing so, she lost control of herself. And the price was paid in blood. It was supposed to be a normal Saturday morning. The kind of morning that gives parents a moment to breathe, where the skies are clear, the air is warm, and for once, life feels light. Emily had been buzzing with excitement since the night before. She had a new watercolor set she wanted to try on the sidewalk canvas of the park, and Maria, our gentle, fiercely protective nanny, had promised her she could spend an hour painting butterflies and stars, her favorite things. I kissed Emily on the forehead as Maria wheeled her out the door, her tiny fingers wrapped around a paper towel roll, her soft curls bouncing under her sun hat. I watched them through the window, heart full, never imagining that within the hour, that same window would be stained with fear and sirens. The park sat quietly in the center of our neighborhood, a patch of green that held so many memories, first steps, birthday balloons, chalk drawings that faded with rain. But it had also become a battleground, Karen's watchtower. She'd always claimed it was unsafe, but only when Emily was there. Other children could climb, run, and scream without consequence. Emily, however, became a symbol of everything Karen despised: nonconformity, disruption, vulnerability she couldn't control. That morning, Maria said the park was peaceful at first. Emily giggled as she painted crooked rainbows across the pavement. A few neighborhood kids joined her, curious about the colors. Maria snapped a photo, later sent to me, of Emily holding up her pink and yellow masterpiece with a toothy smile. "It's a picture," I can't look at anymore. Not without remembering what happened next. Karen showed up like a storm in slow motion, arms crossed, mouth pursed, walking with purpose, but not panic. She stood at the edge of the park, sunglasses covering her eyes, her mouth already mid-sentence before Maria could greet her. "This isn't safe," she barked. "She's making a mess again. Didn't we already talk about this?" Maria tried to de-escalate like she always did. Calm voice, controlled words. "She's just painting on the sidewalk, Karen. It's washable chalk. It'll come off with the next rain." But Karen wasn't there for a conversation. She was there to dominate. "That girl should not be here," she snapped, pointing directly at Emily. "You people keep pushing her into places she doesn't belong." The words hit hard. "You people." That phrase, so sharp, so drenched in bigotry, it made Maria's heart race. She looked around. Parents were watching. Some pulled their kids closer. Others looked away. No one said a word. Karen marched toward them. "You need to pack up and go. Now, I'm on the HOA board, and I can call security." Maria calmly replied, "Then call them. But Emily has every right to be here." That's when Karen's voice cracked into something primal. "You don't get to decide what's right here. This is my neighborhood. I built this community. I'm tired of her kind turning it into a circus." She wasn't yelling anymore, she was roaring. Maria stood between Karen and Emily, protective instinct kicking in. "Don't come any closer, Karen." But Karen took another step, then another, and then she reached into her tote bag. It was so fast, so unthinkable, that Maria didn't realize what was in her hand until it was too late. A small folding knife, silver, maybe 3 inches long, the kind people keep on keychains or in glove boxes. Karen flicked it open with a practice motion. "I said leave," she shouted. "You're trespassing on HOA property, and I'm done being ignored." Maria raised her arms, palms out. "Karen, put that down. This is not okay. You're scaring the children." But Emily was already scared. Her wheelchair rolled back slightly, her hands trembling on the push rims. One of the neighborhood kids screamed. A toddler burst into tears. What happened next still plays in my mind on a loop, like a scene I keep trying to rewrite. Karen took a step closer. Maria moved in between, trying to shield Emily, but Karen's eyes weren't focused anymore. They were wild, lost in the chaos. As Maria tried to hold her back, Karen's arm jerked. The knife came forward, not with force, not a stab, but a sudden, violent swipe meant to intimidate. It caught Emily's arm. A sharp line. A red ribbon instantly opened across her skin. There was a split second of silence. Then the scream. Emily's scream. High-pitched, piercing, the kind that breaks a mother's soul. Maria rushed forward, catching Emily as she trembled, trying to hold her wound, pressing a towel to the cut. Blood was already seeping through. Karen stepped back, shaking, the knife still in her hand, but now her face twisted in horror, or maybe confusion. "I didn't mean to. She moved. I didn't," she muttered, backing away. Other parents finally rushed over. One dialed 911. Another tried to block Karen's exit, but she bolted, just turned and ran, stumbling toward her car, disappearing down the street. She left Emily bleeding. She left Maria crying. She left the neighborhood frozen in shock. I got the call seconds later. Maria's voice was trembling. "Emily's been hurt. Karen, she had a knife. I just come now." I couldn't breathe. I dropped the phone. Everything after that is a blur. I remember running barefoot down the street, still in my robe, neighbors staring as I screamed Emily's name. I saw the flashing lights before I saw her. EMTs were already loading her into the ambulance. Her tiny face was pale. Her arm was bandaged, but blood soaked the gauze. She saw me and cried out, "Mommy," and my legs gave way. I crawled into that ambulance like a soldier crawling through war. At the hospital, they stitched her up. 15 stitches. The doctor said it was a clean cut, no tendon damage, thank God, but she'd need to be monitored for infection. Emily was shaking, eyes wide with trauma. "Why did she cut me, Mommy? Was I bad?" That broke me. I sat on her bed, stroking her hair, telling her over and over, "You are not bad. You are brave. You are beautiful. She was wrong, not you." Maria sat in the corner, holding her own tears, whispering prayers in Spanish. I don't know how we survived that night. The hospital smell, the beeping machines, the fear. The police came that evening. They had statements from witnesses. Some parents had filmed parts of the confrontation. One had captured the moment Karen drew the knife. It wasn't a blur anymore, it was clear, real, evidence. The officers took our report seriously. "We'll find her," one of them promised. But Karen wasn't home. Her house was dark. Her car was gone. She had vanished. The community was in uproar. The next day, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Residents were furious, confused, embarrassed. Some demanded Karen's removal. Others defended her, calling it a mental breakdown, saying she'd never meant to hurt anyone. But the video didn't lie. Karen had brought a weapon to a park filled with children. She had threatened a disabled 5-year-old. And she had drawn blood. There was no excuse for that. The media caught wind within 2 days. HOA board member attacks disabled child in park rage. The headlines screamed. Reporters camped outside our house. We declined interviews. We weren't ready to speak. We were still bleeding. Emily stayed silent for days. She didn't want to go outside, didn't want to paint. She flinched at sudden movements. At night, she'd cry in her sleep, whispering, "Don't hurt me. I'll be quiet." We enrolled her in therapy. She drew pictures, dark ones with red lines and gray skies. The sun was missing from her art. Her joy had been stabbed out of her. It took weeks before the police finally found Karen. She had driven to her sister's house 2 states away, claimed she had blacked out from stress and didn't remember much. She was arrested and charged: assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and child endangerment. Her HOA membership was revoked. She lost her position, her standing, her kingdom. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The cut on Emily's arm would heal, but the one inside, that scar would last longer. We sued, of course, pressed charges, went through legal motions that dragged our hearts through courtrooms and depositions. But no sentence, no verdict, no public apology would undo the image burned into my mind: Emily's blood on the sidewalk, her screams echoing across the swings. And still, in the quietest hours of the night, when the house is dark and Emily's asleep, I sit by her door and ask myself over and over, what if it had been worse? What if the cut had been deeper? What if the knife had struck her neck, her chest, her heart? What if Maria hadn't been there? What if Karen had done more? Those questions haunt me. They chase me into every shadow. Because I saw it. I saw what unchecked power can become. I saw what happens when hate is allowed to wear the mask of policy. Karen didn't just break a law that day. She shattered trust, peace, innocence. She turned a playground into a crime scene, a child's sanctuary into a site of trauma. And for what? Control? Power? Ego? In the end, she walked away with cuffs. But we walked away with wounds. And the worst part? I know we're not alone. Somewhere, in another suburb, another Karen is waiting, with a clipboard, a rule book, and maybe, God forbid, something worse. The fight back began the very night we returned from a hospital. Our daughter stitched, sedated, her body bandaged, but her spirit bruised in ways even the doctors couldn't treat. I sat at the kitchen table, clutching the police report like a lifeline, eyes burning with rage and resolve. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I had become something else: an avenger, a protector, a parent who knew the only way forward was through the fire. We filed the formal charges that night: assault with a deadly weapon, endangerment of a minor, use of a weapon in a public place. The officers were supportive, but you could see in their eyes the quiet disbelief that something like this had happened in our neighborhood, under their jurisdiction. Karen had been a familiar face to them, a model citizen, a board member who called about suspicious packages or garbage bins left out overnight, not someone they expected to be wielding a knife at a disabled child in a public park. Still, we gave them the videos, the photos, the witness statements. They said it was enough, that they'd issue the warrant. But What I didn't expect, what blindsided me, was the HOA's response. Instead of outrage, instead of solidarity, the HOA board released a statement to the neighborhood that made my stomach turn. We are aware of the unfortunate incident involving Mrs. Karen Whitmore and another resident's child. While we await the outcome of the investigation, we remind our community not to rush to judgment. Mrs. Whitmore has served our neighborhood with dedication for years and deserves a fair hearing. Fair hearing? My daughter was still crying in her sleep, her bandages still fresh, and these people wanted to protect Karen's reputation? I was done being polite. I replied with my own letter, distributed it to every mailbox in the subdivision, emailed it to the neighborhood thread. I included stills from the video footage, a timestamped timeline of the event, and a message. If this were your child, would you still be neutral? The community split almost instantly. Some neighbors offered support, meals, flowers, cards. Others stopped making eye contact. One even muttered, "This is all being blown out of proportion," while walking her dog. Then came the worst blow. Karen lawyered up and, through her attorney, filed a statement claiming self-defense. She said Maria had become hostile, that Emily had charged at her aggressively in her wheelchair, and that Karen instinctively pulled out a personal safety tool in fear. The lies were so absurd they'd be laughable if they weren't so dangerous. She claimed my daughter, who can barely roll over a curb without assistance, had made her feel threatened enough to draw a knife. It was a narrative soaked in manipulation and desperation, and somehow, it gained traction with a small group of loyalists in the HOA. That was when I knew we needed help. Real help. I contacted a civil rights attorney, Monica DeWitt, a fierce, composed woman with a spine of steel and the courtroom record to match. She took one look at the case and said, "They picked the wrong family to mess with." Monica filed a civil suit alongside the criminal charges. We were suing Karen personally for damages, trauma, and emotional distress. But we also launched a claim against the HOA for negligence, complicity, and enabling discriminatory behavior. We dug deep into HOA records, minutes from past meetings, complaints that had been quietly dismissed. And what we found shocked even me. Karen had a history, a long one. Over the past 5 years, there had been more than 24 informal complaints filed against her. Parents said she had followed their teens home, scolded kids for loitering, and once even called animal control on a family dog that barked too loud. One elderly couple had written that Karen accused them of inviting unwanted guests because their grandchildren played on their lawn. Nothing had ever escalated until Emily, and every single complaint had either been buried in bureaucracy or swept aside by her inner circle of loyalists. The board was her kingdom, and she had ruled it unchecked. Until now, the lawsuit broke the silence. Local news picked up the story. It started with a blog post, then an article, then a full segment on the evening news. HOA nightmare. Woman allegedly attacks disabled child in park dispute. That headline ran across screens from Atlanta to New York. Social media erupted. I posted a single photo, Emily's bandaged arm, her hand clutching a paintbrush, and a message, "This is what HOA control looks like when left unchecked." It went viral overnight. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Emily and hashtag HOA Reform Now began trending in regional circles. And with that exposure came pressure. The city launched its own investigation. The HOA board, now under scrutiny, suddenly found its backbone. They held an emergency vote to remove Karen from the board, and she was officially ousted within a week. A few members resigned in shame. A new interim board was formed, and for the first time, it included voices who had been silenced for years, parents, renters, and residents from underrepresented backgrounds. A neighbor I barely knew rang my doorbell and said, "I'm so sorry we let this go on for so long. We should have stood with you earlier." That meant something, even if it came too late. Meanwhile, in court, Karen's defense unraveled. The video footage was undeniable. Her own past complaints painted a picture of someone who had long blurred the line between regulation and harassment. Her claim of self-defense didn't hold up when the prosecution replayed the moment she took a step toward a seated child with a knife in her hand. Witnesses testified. Maria testified. And when I took the stand, I looked the jury in the eye and said, this wasn't an accident. This was a pattern. This was power gone unchecked. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. Karen was found guilty of assault and endangerment. She was sentenced to probation, community service, and mandatory anger management. It wasn't jail time, but it was a conviction, a permanent mark on her record. In the civil case, she was ordered to pay damages and cover Emily's therapy for the next 5 years. The HOA settled out of court, agreeing to reform its bylaws, install oversight, and publicly apologize. None of it could erase what happened. The scar on Emily's arm remains. The fear in her eyes when she sees a stranger approach still flickers. But something changed in our neighborhood, and maybe even beyond. People began to speak out. Stories emerged of other HOAs across the country facing similar reckonings. A movement, however small, began to form, a demand for HOA accountability, for empathy to replace ego, for justice to matter more than power. Karen lost everything she once used to define herself. Her title, her power, her influence. We lost, too, pieces of our peace, fragments of our faith in people. But we also gained something, a community that opened its eyes, a daughter who learned that her voice mattered, and a family who, despite the trauma, stood tall. This wasn't just our fight. It became everyone's. Because when one person abuses power and everyone else stays silent, the whole neighborhood bleeds. But when one family says enough, sometimes, just sometimes, the silence breaks. In the days and weeks that followed the courtroom verdict, our home was no longer a war zone of fear and heartbreak. It became a sanctuary of healing. Emily's physical recovery came slowly but surely. The stitches on her arm dissolved, and the wound faded into a thin, pink line. A scar, yes, but also a mark of resilience. She stopped waking up from nightmares every night, though there are still evenings when she cried quietly into her pillow and needed me to sit beside her, gently brushing her curls back as I whispered that she was safe now. That Karen couldn't hurt her anymore. The therapists worked wonders with her. Through art therapy, she began drawing again, first just in black and white, but eventually color returned. One day, she handed me a picture of a girl in a wheelchair flying through a rainbow-colored sky, her arms outstretched like wings. "It's me," she said simply. That's when I knew my daughter hadn't just survived, she had risen. Karen, on the other hand, had become a ghost of the figure she once was. Her name had been stripped from every HOA bulletin board, her title revoked, her influence shattered. The restraining order we filed barred her from coming within 500 feet of our family, our home, or the park. Her once perfectly manicured house sat cold and empty for months before a for sale sign quietly appeared out front. No goodbye, no closure, just her silent retreat. The few allies she once had in the community faded away, embarrassed to have ever defended her. Her fall from grace was sharp, complete, and well-deserved. But justice didn't come only in the form of her punishment. It came in what followed. The HOA underwent a transformation I never would have believed possible. Spurred by public pressure and the settlement agreement, they revised their bylaws to include explicit protections against discriminatory enforcement, ableist restrictions, and abuse of power. A community oversight committee was formed, diverse, inclusive, and transparent. Gone were the secret meetings and passive-aggressive rule enforcement. In their place were town halls, open voting, and feedback from residents actually listened to. The park itself was renovated, made more accessible with new play structures for kids with disabilities, and a mural wall where children could paint freely without fear of complaint. The first painting on that wall? A sunflower with the name Emily at the center. Our neighborhood changed, not overnight, but steadily. People began speaking to each other again. Divides started to heal. I was invited to share our story at local forums, schools, and even a city council meeting on community governance. What began as a mother's worst nightmare slowly transformed into a movement for empathy, inclusion, and reform. But none of that would have mattered if Emily hadn't stood at the center of it all, radiating quiet strength. She had become a symbol not just in our family, but in the entire community. A symbol of what happens when courage meets cruelty and still refuses to crumble. We eventually hosted a day of light at the park, something Emily came up with herself. Let's make a day where nobody feels left out, she said. We invited every family, every child, every neighbor. There were chalk drawings, bubble machines, free popsicles, and music. Maria brought her homemade lemonade, and Emily handed out little heart stickers that said, "You belong." I watched her that day, laughing, wheeling down the path with a train of other children behind her like she was leading a parade, and I knew we were okay. Not the same, not untouched, but okay. I won't lie, there are moments when the fear still creeps in, when a stranger lingers too long near the park fence, when I see a folding knife at a hardware store, when someone questions Emily's presence in a space not built for her. But I remind myself, we fought back. We didn't cower. We didn't break. And because of that, change happened. Karen brought a knife to a park full of children. She brought hate to a place meant for joy. But what she didn't realize, what she could never control, was what we would bring in return. We brought light. We brought justice. We brought a story that will be told not as a tragedy, but as a turning point. And at the heart of it always will be a little girl with paint on her fingers and a spirit too strong to be silenced. If you're still watching, thank you. Thank you for hearing our story, for walking with us through the heartbreak, the fear, and ultimately the fight for justice. Because this wasn't just about one horrible day in the park. It was about the silent war so many families are fighting right now against people who use power to belittle, policies to exclude, and fear to control. Maybe you felt it too. Maybe you've lived in a neighborhood where the rules were used like weapons. Maybe someone tried to make you feel like you or your child didn't belong. Maybe you've watched someone like Karen act untouchable, unchecked, unpunished, while you were told to stay quiet, not make waves, and let it go. But let me say this clearly, you are not alone. My daughter, 5 years old, unable to walk but full of more bravery than most adults, was told, without words but through actions, that her existence was inconvenient. And yet she stood her ground. She kept tainting. She kept smiling. She kept living. So, if you've ever been silenced, bullied, or made to feel small, don't back down. Stand tall, like my daughter did. This world doesn't change because people in power make it better. It changes because ordinary people refuse to let injustice slide. Every time someone speaks up, every time someone files a complaint, every time a parent says enough, the balance of power shifts. So, I'm asking you now, don't let this story fade. Share it. Talk about it. Leave a comment below if you've ever experienced HOA harassment, bullying, or discrimination. Let others know they're not alone. Let's make this a place for voices that we're told to whisper. Because together, we're louder than any clipboard, rulebook, or title. And if you're watching this as someone in power, on an HOA board, in a community role, let this be your wake-up call. Leadership without empathy is just control. It's time to do better. On this channel, HOA Justice, we're building a space for stories like these. For truth, for reform, and for healing. Every week, we share real stories of families who stood up to bullies hiding behind HOA policies, community rules, or legal loopholes. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, and most importantly, share it. Someone out there needs to hear it. Someone out there needs to know that justice is possible. That change is real. That even when the system fails, we don't have to. From our family to yours, thank you. For standing with us, for believing in justice, and for reminding the world that even in the darkest moments, there is always light. You just have to be brave enough to shine it.